We are going to start the debate that has been advertised for tonight's meeting. Uh, so let me see. I see that uh, I don't see whether Jonathan has joined us yet. Jonathan?
Here I am.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay. So this before starting, let me just say that this is a meeting of SaveMuni, and we're happy to have guests here, and we welcome you all. The debate is going to be structured in this way. We have a spokesperson for the proponents, and that's Jonathan Ruers. And I have to mention that Jonathan is here as an individual on his own time, and is here supporting Proposition A. Proposition A is the $400 million bond issue that the Muni wants for various purposes that will be on the June ballot. So the way we'll have it is Jonathan will make his statement for 4 minutes, and then we'll turn it over to the opponent, who I'll introduce after Jonathan finishes. Jonathan, go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Bob. And you said 4 minutes, right?
Yes, sir.
All right. Thank you very much. So good evening, everyone. My name is Jonathan Ruers, and I am here on my own time, on my own computer, in my own home here in the Mission in San Francisco to talk to you about Proposition A, which is the Muni Reliability and Street Safety General Obligation Bond. This bond is part of the City and County of San Francisco's 10-year capital plan. So it's been in the works for a long time. It started all the way back in 2012 and 2013 when the City and County of San Francisco completed a mayor's transportation task force to look at all of the capital needs of the city's transportation system. So that's Muni, that's facilities, that's traffic signals, that's street safety, all the elements of capital that are managed by the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency. There were 2 bonds proposed as part of that plan in 2013. The first one passed with 71% of the support of San Francisco voters in 2014. That was also Proposition A. And this is the second of the 2 planned general obligation bonds. This bond is focused largely based on feedback from the community on the state of good repair of the transportation system. So there have been a lot of new projects in San Francisco, a lot of expansion of the transportation system, but this bond really focuses on fixing the system to make sure as the city reopens that Muni is reliable and on time, and that we're dealing with our state of good repair. So a key investment is the investment in Muni facilities. Many of you have seen over the past 7 or 8 years that Muni had the oldest transit fleet in the United States, now has one of the newest. With replaced and new vehicles in the final phase of replacing the Muni fleet with new light rail vehicles. The bond funds a huge component to replace facilities, in some cases that are over 100 years old, are not seismically safe, and do not have the technologies necessary to fully maintain and maintain reliably the Muni fleet. Another core element of the bond is to fund projects on the streets that increase the reliability of Muni, so more people will ride it. So that's dedicated lanes, transit signal priority, and also providing dollars that will allow San Francisco to leverage a significant component of federal infrastructure bills that were passed this past year. One component of the bond is $10 million for a new Muni train control system. Again, the train control system is about at the end of its useful life. So this is another core state of good repair project. But that $10 million will leverage state and federal funds, almost in the amount of $300 million for this project. So it represents San Francisco's local commitment to this important project. The remainder of the bond goes for important street safety and street state of good repair elements. As an example, $42 million of the bond will go to traffic signals and traffic signal replacement across San Francisco. If you didn't know, San Francisco's traffic signals in total should be replaced about every 30 years. We are on about an every 60-year cycle in replacing our traffic signals. So that includes the mast arms, the signal heads, the conduit underground. All of those elements need to be replaced over time. And there just hasn't been enough significant revenues to keep up with the pace of replacement and keeping that infrastructure in a state of good repair. $42 million also goes towards major corridor improvements. So that's where street improvements on multiple blocks need to be completed around pedestrian safety, access, traffic signal improvements, sidewalk expansion, bulb outs, and other ADA improvements. The last $30 million of the bond goes towards meeting San Francisco's Vision Zero commitment. And that includes specifically projects and programs that will reduce the speed on San Francisco streets, which is the #1 way to ensure if there is a collision, it is not a fatal collision. That will go towards traffic calming across San Francisco. So application-based traffic calming, proactive traffic calming, with things that you've seen, speed humps and other light civil improvements, and things that you've seen through the SFMTA's Vision Zero Quick Build program. So I think one of the most important components out of this bond focuses on state of good repair, focuses on reliability, focuses on street safety, is the fact that because it's part of the city and county of San Francisco's rotating general obligation bond program, that it's not a tax increase. It is simply using the financing that has existed for prior bonds to issue new bonds for further capital improvements across San Francisco. So that is my quick intro. I probably didn't even take 4 full minutes, but thank you very much, Bob.
Thank you. Now for the opponents to Prop A, Larry Marceau, who is an economist and a lawyer, and is advocating a no vote on Prop A. Larry, your 4 minutes. Larry? Would you unmute yourself?
Yes.
Larry?
Before starting my time, can I just check that the audio is working for you?
Yeah, sure. It's good for me. I can hear you. Go ahead.
Well, then I'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much. So, yes, I am here representing no on Proposition A, but I am here, as I hope all of you are, to save Muni. I think we will get into a lot of numbers tonight, but and I do take the position that Proposition A is a tax increase on property owners. It's a tax increase on renters, and in the arena of general obligation property tax related payments, it's a 15% tax increase over the next 4 years. It is true, property taxes have been higher in the past, but from where we are right now, 15% increase over the next 4 years under the San Francisco Capital Plan. And I want to get into some significant additional risks posed by inflation in the municipal bond markets, because the rate at which homeowners and renters will be assessed taxes from all of the general obligation bonds in the city is not up to the city. It's up to the bondholders who purchase these bonds as they are issued, tranche by tranche. Inflation causes rates to go up. Right now, the municipal bond rate paid by San Francisco is around 2%. In 1982, at the height of the inflation following the Carter administration into the Reagan administration, the municipal bond rate was 13.25%. I mean no disrespect to the hard work that's been done by commission after commission, working group after working group. The reports, the planning is outstanding to review transportation 2030, 2045, 2050. Take a look at the 5-year capital improvement plan of the SFMTA, the 10-year capital plan of the city, the 20-year capital plan of MTA. You have the state of good repair report, the beauty reliability group, report after report. They all have subtle differences, but there is something in common. It's all pre-pandemic thinking. The problem with passing the bond as it stands and pursuing this plan is that, just step back here because I'm not permitted to put up graphs, I'm told. The 2050 plan literally says that we thought revenues looked like this and expenses looked like this, same line. But now revenues, they look like this, going as far as the eye can see. And, well, expenses they're the same old line, so we have a deficit as far as the eye can see. It gets bigger and bigger forever. And so we need other sources of funds for our capital investment, and we need new revenue sources. By the way, Plan 2045 also says soon in a future on a future ballot, we are going to put on a new tax increase, which for some reason has dropped from the public discussion. I see I'm at my 4 minutes. I look forward to some questioning because there's a lot to talk about.
Thank you, Larry. All right, now the way we'll handle the questions is this. I know there are a lot of people who want to ask a lot of questions. So I want you to please keep the questions short. Keep the questions to no more than a minute. And then we're going to give the person to whom the question is directed a minute and a half to respond, and then the other person can have a rebuttal for another minute. So we'd like to get as many questions as possible. Yes, who's this?
Bob, are we going to go forward with the plan that that Jonathan and I were going to ask each other a question?
Yes, I would like to do that. I'm just specifying how the questions will be handled. Yes, as part of this debate, I included that each proponent would ask the other a question, and each person would have a minute and a half to respond to that question. And I think I said that, Larry, you would go first in asking a question of Jonathan, and then Jonathan will ask a question of you, and then we will get into the questions from the audience. So go ahead, Larry, your question for Jonathan.
In December, Bob Rosenberg, city controller, wrote a memo at the request of Mayor Breed and the Board of Supervisors to the SFMTA to comment on its methodology for forecasts. And he raised 2 points, and Jonathan, I'd like to hear your response. His first point is that the MTA had, and this is a memo dated December of last year, the city controller says that the MTA has underestimated future revenue and has underestimated future has underestimated future revenue and overestimated future costs to the tune of a $500 million surplus, more than the amount of this bond issuance. He also said, and he recommended, that Muni issue no indebtedness until you had put in place a contingency planning program, waited at least 2 years, and had evidence of a downside scenario that he doesn't see in your forecast. Could you respond to that?
I think so. I think you were talking about City Controller Ben Rosenfield.
Yes, thank you so much.
And I think you were referring to the review of the SFMTA's revenues. I don't remember those specific quotes in that memo. I do think that in that memo, there is a more optimistic view of the recovery of the city than I think the MTA has. But I think that that's part of what you brought up here, Larry. There is some pre-pandemic thinking going on here that simply because the city recovers and the city general fund recovers and that people maybe come back to the city, that their transportation choices will be the same, and that the enterprise revenues that the MTA receives from those choices will be the same. So the methodology change in that memo had a lot to do with the pace and how a city recovery would occur. And so there was an adjustment based on certain levels of assumption as to when the city would fully recover. Now, that being said, we have looked, and I looked at cities around the world, and cities where there is significant use of public transportation, significant use, has not seen 100% of ridership return. And if 100% of ridership doesn't return, then 100% of fare revenues don't return. I think many in the SaveMuni group know that the city has implemented shared spaces throughout the city, which has positive economic impact on small and local businesses in San Francisco. But that's a loss of parking spaces. Will shared spaces return? Will the same number of people drive? I think it's pre-pandemic thinking to think if everybody returns to work and the city recovers, that people's transportation choices will be the same. So I think that's a little bit of a difference. But when we talk about the GEO bond and capital specifically, I do remember the end of that memo on the last page says that the SFMTA has had long-standing shortfalls in capital resources, that report after report, as you quoted, has noted that. And this GEO bond now is really about how to close the need on those capital sources. And specifically, I think with regard to pre-pandemic thinking and today, definitely true that the idea of doing this GEO bond was before the pandemic, that it was based on scenarios looked at in the past. But I think what we heard during the pandemic is that people want Muni not to build a new M-line subway underground right now, not extend the central subway to Fisherman's Wharf. They want the overhead to be fixed. They want not delayed vehicles in the tunnel. They want their traffic signals to be fixed and for congestion to be managed in San Francisco. So I think the change post-pandemic is that the program of what those bond dollars will be used for is to fix the system, which is what I think overwhelmingly what we've heard from San Franciscans.
Okay.
Thank you for the question, Larry.
That was a very long response. Jonathan, in view of that, would you care to still ask a question of Larry, or would you waive that?
I think I responded to a bunch of Larry's statements, so I think he kind of knows. I appreciate everything that Larry said. Like, I think he stated some fair facts, and they are facts.
Thank you for your answer. Very helpful.
So,
okay.
and they're legitimate concerns that can be brought up with any of the city's GEO bonds in the GEO bond program. So, I'd say that.
Okay. All right. So we're now going to move into some questions first from SaveMuni folks, and then from those of you who are joining us for the first time. So I think Paul Cummings had his hand up. So Paul, a succinct question, please. You have to unmute.
I'm unmuting. Thank you very much for the chance to ask a question. This is primarily for the proponent of the bond. You've listed a long list of worthy goals and projects for the bond. However, in the time I've been on SaveMuni and on Batwig before that, I've heard the same things every time we've gone to election day. What have we accomplished in the last dozen years that tells us we should be putting out more money in order to do this? And I'll just make a comment about the BRT, and the cost overruns on that have been, to my mind, scandalous. We may end up with a great system, and I hope we do, but the amount of money that was spent on it is far and above what should have been for making an extra lane down Van Ness.
Okay. Jonathan, I think that's to you. Go ahead.
So there are two different issues in that question. The first one is what has been done related to these programs across the city in the past 10 years. Muni replaced its entire bus fleet with a much more efficient, electric, non-polluting fleet. It is new flyer, so that means there was efficiencies in how that fleet was purchased and delivered. So if you look at the Muni fleet today, you generally see the same vehicle. There's some trolleys, there's 40-foot, there's 60-foot, but they've got the same chassis, they have the same body, they have the same window. That creates efficiencies in how those vehicles are maintained, how quickly they can get out on the street, and consistency in managing the overall system. The transit effect.
May I interrupt for 1 second, please? I think you may have misinterpreted my question. Perhaps we voted on upgrading the Muni bus fleet. And if we did, great. It's a wonderful accomplishment. And I agree with you all about better maintenance. However, we've talked about pedestrian safety and train controls since we're blue in the face. How have we gone about getting those things implemented, which we still want to implement in this bond?
Okay, go ahead.
Oh, sure. I mean, the needs for Vision Zero in the 20-year capital plan are in the billions of dollars. The train control system project is $400 million. It is being phased out, and there are different elements of it. That is a 10-year capital project. So in some cases, this is a $400 million general obligation bond out of a more than $2 billion capital program. So the GEO bond is one element of very complicated funding plans for multiple elements of these projects. So yes, in some cases, there are going to be asks for similar things like traffic signals. The local transportation sales tax pays for traffic signals, but I told you it isn't enough. We're falling behind. The state of good repair is falling behind. So that's where in some cases you're going to see the same ask. On Muni facilities specifically, the MTA has attempted to fund that through federal grants, through going to the region, but the region doesn't make that a priority. So now there are yards and facilities that are over 100 years old that are not seismically safe. The city's seen the same thing with police stations and fire stations and have invested to upgrade those specific facilities. In the past couple years, the MTA moved out of its old overhead lines facility, built a new one at its central warehouse, didn't change the plant of the building, and built a new, modern, seismically safe overhead lines facility. So in the case of an emergency or an earthquake, those staff can get their equipment and take care of the overhead lines across San Francisco. So not going to claim perfection by any means, but are the capital requirements and the investments in this infrastructure needed? I think even Larry made the case that yes, they are documented as a need.
Okay. Larry, do you have a response?
Yes, I do. While I have great respect and appreciation for plans 2030, 2045, and 2050, they are not post-pandemic plans. And Paul, thank you so much for highlighting how aspirations and expressed prior to elections have not always made sense when we look back on a review of accomplishments. I think we need to take a close look at the future of Muni where we are right now, post-pandemic, because when I hear that we need to fulfill the pre-pandemic infrastructure plan, it's ridiculous for a system that has 50% of the utilization it had before, for a system that has 25% of the peak exits in downtown, which represented 1/3 of prior ridership. We have a different transportation challenge today, and a situation that very possibly could be permanent. And remarkably, we have city leaders who look at this as a crisis rather than an opportunity. An opportunity, it's an opportunity for our economy, an opportunity for our environment, an opportunity for our underserved communities, an opportunity to connect our neighborhoods, an opportunity to direct resources that have been to priorities that have been ignored for decades. Instead, the MTA is talking about fulfilling infrastructure plans. The Board of Supervisors last September, I think, passed Resolution 38921. You know what that said? It said, Muni, get back to a 100% full operating schedule that you had pre-pandemic. All the lines, all the prior schedules, regardless of utilization. It's a little bit like when Mayor Breed and on the other side of the country, Mayor of New York, Eric Adams, waved their fingers and said to the citizens, get back to work, even though most of us already were working, but differently, hybrid work, at home, remote. Society has changed. The MTA is looking at 50 years of deficits in Plan 2050 and still talking about the same plan. I think that there's a real opportunity here, and I hope we can address it in further questioning. Thank you.
Okay, good. George Wooding, hi, how are you? Your
Good.
question.
How you been? Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Jonathan. My question is for both of you, but primarily it would be for Jonathan financially. In the 2015 transportation bond, there were 3 tranches of money. The last tranche was distributed in, I believe, October, of around $134 million. And so far, only 9% has been spent, which gives you a tremendous amount of bond money to be activated and used going forward. And as Mr. Mazzo said, with a new bond, we're going to be changing the interest rates substantially. So I think right now, given the current change, Muni has quite a bit of money. They're going to be getting more money from city's Proposition K transportation sales tax. And in November, they're going to be getting more, another half-cent tax. Their state gas taxes, federal grants, and unspent bond money, which I just talked about, are already paying into improve San Francisco streets and public transit. And what I don't understand is what, just like Mr. Mazzo was saying, why do you need this money now when you have so much money in hand? You're saying that you're going to spend this money in 3 years, and I'm saying, no, you're not, because you just spent 6 years and you could only spend 2/3 of the money you had. So that's my question to you is, what is Muni doing financially that citizens can trust. Thank you.
Okay. Well, that's for you, Jonathan. Go ahead.
Sure. Thank you. Great question. First, I suggest that all of the group look at every city general obligation bond and see if those dollars are actually spent within 10 years, or even if all of the money is issued within 6 years. I think the issuance schedule and putting that bond money onto projects has actually been pretty fast since 2014. That said, you are correct. The last issuance was about a year ago, but the majority of that issuance was not for muni projects. And I repeat again, the majority of that issuance was not for muni projects. A core component of the last issuance was for the Better Market Street project, which is managed by the Department of Public Works and which is just about to have its contract awarded for the first phase. A huge component of that last issuance was for the canopy project over the canopies at the portals of the joint BART Muni Metro stations along Market Street. That project is managed by BART. The last component and a component of that bond issuance was for the Caltrain electrification project. So the city had a capital commitment to the Caltrain electrification project, and part of that last issuance was for that project. There was a component for El Taravel and some street projects that the MTA was doing. The El Taravel project is in construction. So most of the projects that Muni was managing and implementing were funded and were in process. The outstanding bond issuance had to do with a lot of projects not managed by Muni, by other entities where their cash flow, because of the period of time of the projects, like electrification, canopies and escalators, Better Market Street, were taking significantly more time. So I want to be clear about that. Again, I do want to get back and to answer the question directly. Again, the voters of San Francisco, from what we've heard, want investment in state of good repair. So this bond is not funding new things. It is funding the replacement of traffic signals, where today we have to physically send out somebody from the signal shop to change signal timing for pedestrians and to manage traffic. Most other modern cities can control their traffic signals from a central traffic control center. San Francisco yet does not have the capability to do that. So just replacing traffic signals where the sales tax is insufficient to keep up with replacing every signal at 1,200 intersections every 30 years. This bond funds overhead lines and the replacement of the train control system. It's replacement. It is modern technology, so we can get more trains going through the Muni Metro tunnel. So a lot of what's in this bond is just fix the infrastructure that San Francisco has. Take care of the state of good repair. Take care of the backlog that the city has in this infrastructure. In doing so, to take care of those long-term forever deficits, the hope is that the cost to maintain that infrastructure when the traffic signal is 45, 50 years old is reduced and less costly. The number of disruptions that occur in the Muni Metro tunnel are reduced and require less staff time to deal with. So again, the post-pandemic thought, based on a survey done by the MTA, was that San Franciscans want the system fixed. That is where they want the investment to go. So, yep, not all the bond funds from 2014 are spent. The last issuance was largely for non-Muni projects. The future bond is focused on state of good repair and infrastructure to make the system work for everyone.
Okay, Larry, quick rebuttal, if any.
Sure. So Jonathan refers a lot to the signal upgrade and replacement. I'll remind you that it's 10 million of the 400 million. When we look at the 250 million that we understand is to be allocated to replacing physical facilities and infrastructure, it's hard to know exactly what the priorities are. I'll give you an example of something that caught my eye, and it concerns me. So the Potrero bus facility. This is going to be one of these maintenance and storage facilities. They're going to shut down an existing facility and construct a new one. Well, here is what the plan says. We're going to build 3 floors of maintenance and storage for buses. And then on top of that, 7 more floors. 7 more floors of affordable housing. 560 units of affordable housing. Now, because this project is going to have a lot of moving pieces and be complicated, over at Metro Center East, Phase 2, they're going to build a temporary storage facility for some of the buses that will have no home during the interim. And that's already a $120 million project. So how many different priorities are we serving at the same time? That's one thing that jumped out at me. And we're transitioning to shared spaces programs that are going to be longer in duration, more permanent. Perhaps you've all seen the new rules that have been promulgated, fortunately delayed for a bit. But what we've learned about the planned upgrades along Geary between Standing and 23rd, a lot of the developments of parklets, they're all going to be ripped out. And the city does have some obligation to those who've constructed them. It turns out that the mitigation money is expected to come from the bond. The bond that is supposed to fund Geary Bus Rapid Transit is going to pay mitigation charges to the restaurants up and down Geary. So really, a lot of this money is not going to Muni. It's going to other priorities.
All right. Thank you. Next, Sue. Is that Sue Vaughn? Sue? You're muted. You're next up if you want to ask a question.
Yes, it's me. I'm here. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yes, I can. Go ahead, Sue.
Okay, so thanks. So thank you, JR. Thank you, Jonathan. I take notes and I've got you listed as JR. And thank you, Larry, for your presentations. I have questions for both of you. So Larry, you mentioned that, so you're opposed to this bond because the interest rates are not set by, they're set by whomever, like financiers on Wall Street or something like that. And you mentioned the need for other sources for capital and other revenue sources. So Larry, I'd like to know, what are your suggestions? And for Jonathan, I asked this question as a member of the Citizens Advisory Council about other kinds of taxes and what other possibilities are there. And for example, the parcel tax, and then also up the possibility of doing something like what was done a few years ago, the Prop C, where anything over revenues over 50 million would be taxed at a higher rate. So 2 questions, one for Larry, one for Jonathan, and thank you so much.
Yeah, let's start this time with Larry. They both basically sound as though they relate to other revenue sources other than this bond issue. Go ahead, Larry.
I think the point the city controller made is that the MTA has dramatic, unexpected revenues, at least unexpected by the MTA. Pension funds have wildly exceeded expectations. Federal grants wildly in excess of what's in all of the planning documents with the MTA label on them. The city controller says that those same documents are all mistaken in their calculation of the general fund allocations to the MTA in all their forecasts. Again, the sum total, $523 million over the next 5 years. How's that for a new source of revenue? And from the standpoint of this $400 million bond, this is not the only place that Muni can get capital or plans to get capital. If Beauty stays on the full capital plan, its 20-year capital plan, the city's 10-year capital plan, its 5-year capital plan, this is only 7% of Muni's capital budget. Fully funded the other 93%, fully funded already. Federal, state, local sources. And by the way, if you take a broader view of transportation, so you include regional contributions to regional transportation, say BART, Caltrain, this bond only represents 4% of San Francisco's spending San Francisco's spending on transportation in capital investment in transportation over the next 10 years. So the answer to your question, Sue, is that the MTA doesn't need additional revenues. What it needs to do is change its strategy dramatically. And I hope we have questions and an opportunity to talk about that.
Okay, Jonathan, go ahead. Maybe you want to make a couple of comments about what Larry said, but also the question that Sue raised for you. Go ahead.
Sure, thank you. So let me quote the memo from City Ben Rosenfield, controller. So quote number 1, overall, MTA's forecast methodology is reasonable and their assumptions regarding major costs and revenue streams are generally in line with those used by our office. So I am directly quoting the memo. I will quote again the last section of the memo. While forecasts have improved, we note that the structural gap remains to be addressed in later years of our forecast. Unless economic and financial conditions improve slightly from even our own more optimistic scenarios, the structural deficit comes later in the outer years. We believe that such strategies will be likely to meet this gap and remaining significant gaps in maintenance and capital funding, which are not included in these projections. So we're getting operations dollars and capital dollars mixed up. So the controller's office memo did not deal with capital, but again, which are not included in these projections, but are well established in prior reports by our office and others. So that is what the controller's office said. To answer Sue's question and back to the reports that we keep referencing, the reports give Transportation 2045 specifically has multiple pages on different revenue sources potentially that could be used for transportation. The recommendation of that group was that this general obligation bond proceed and that some long-term operating revenue measure was necessary. And there are numerous options, Sue, that you brought up, like parcel tax, special transportation tax. And I think over the next 2 years, a lot of those from that report will be evaluated to deal with the operating deficit. This general obligation bond, again, though, addresses capital. which is a long-standing need not only for the MTA, but for many different infrastructure departments across San Francisco. So again, the change in methodology, again, the last bond paid for Muni Forward, Red Lanes, expansion projects that had been long planned. This bond focuses on core infrastructure, state of good repair, because it doesn't matter. Muni needs a train control system. Muni needs seismically safe maintenance bays and maintenance facilities, no matter the size of the fleet. Okay, the city needs its traffic signals to be in a state of good repair so we can manage congestion. Intersections that have long-standing safety issues need to be redesigned and reconstructed. Those are the needs of San Francisco, and hopefully that's what this bond will fund.
To the person who has a beeping hum that's coming through, would you try to diagnose what the problem is and solve it? Because it's several people have commented on it. Next up, Robin, you're next.
Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Yeah, thank you to both speakers here. I really appreciate it. It's a very good debate here. So my question is that Jonathan said it would not be a tax increase, and then Larry says it is. And my question is, how does a general obligation bond turn automatically into a tax increase? And I think, Larry, you said it would be a tax increase on homeowners and renters. So I'm not clear about all of that, just in general for myself as well, how it works. If you could explain why you think it's a tax increase and how it would be and who would be affected, et cetera.
Yeah, okay, that's to you, Larry. Go ahead.
Great. Since I will address your question in a moment, I note that Jonathan jumped the last question to respond to the question I asked him at the beginning, and I would like to similarly quote the city controller's memo, because I think he's misleading the crowd here. He says quite clearly that we recommend that other one-time strategies, including deferral of maintenance costs, capital expenditures, or use of debt, be employed only in contingency plans. And he's talking about the structural gap that remains to be addressed in later years of our forecast. So he does not see the need for Proposition A. And he wrote this prior to Proposition A coming on the ballot. It may not be what the mayor wanted to hear. It may not be what the Board of Supervisors wanted to hear. But the city controller came out against borrowing by the MTA at this time. Okay, I'm sorry to take a moment. I will now turn to the question. Yes, so general obligation bonds of the city of San Francisco, they're municipal bonds, and they are issued backed by the full faith and credit of the homeowners and other property owners of the city of San Francisco. In other words, the taxing authority of the city of San Francisco applied to the residents and commercial and industrial property owners here in San Francisco. So the city, as a part of the bond, promises that it will impose property taxes, and this is specifically permitted under Proposition 13, a long-standing constitutional provision here in California that limits the use of property taxes. General obligation bonds are permitted to be funded only if passed by 2/3 of the voters, which is why we're having this election. And the problem is that although the city's capital plan, 10-year capital plan, has a nice little graph in it that shows that just a little while ago, yes, taxes were higher. Now, property taxes related to general obligation bonds are lower than they've been in a while. If we pass this bond, what happens is the government is going to go out, San Francisco, and issue, and in fact, I think Jonathan can confirm this, it's the MTA's intention to issue a significant number of the bonds of this 400 million in the first 3 years, and essentially sort of flood the bond market and generate a lot of this new tax liability in the first few years. So what this will mean is that tax rates will begin to rise on every homeowner and every renter in the city of San Francisco. And in terms of the property taxes that relate to general obligation bonds of this kind, it is a 15% increase. And that's how it works. But here's the problem. That's the city using today's municipal bond rate. Well, the problem is we've had 7% inflation now, and maybe it's going to be worse for a handful of months. What happens when inflation of that order looks like it might be longstanding? Or what if it gets worse? Municipal bonds are not going to sell for 2%. If taxpayers, if San Francisco goes out to the bond market, this could be very expensive financing. No, but first of all, I think it would be much better if Muni could find a way. And I think if we could talk about the mission of Muni post-pandemic, I hope there will be questions about this, that Muni does not need to engage in this capital program, in this specific capital program. I mean, the 7% of its overall capital program we're talking about, that other monies can be applied, because this is potentially very expensive financing. And once we authorize this as taxpayers, this 400, there's another 2 billion already authorized from some of these prior bond programs in the areas of things like homelessness and affordable housing that are not infrastructure. So San Francisco's in a pretty precarious situation. The way that the government analyzes these bonds, we only have a capacity of 1.5 billion left. This will use 400 million of it, and general obligation bonds are scheduled to be used for earthquake preparedness, for the waterfront, for earthquake safety. These are infrastructure needs that don't have natural revenue streams. So, I think all of this has to be taken into consideration.
Jonathan, do you have a very quick response?
I hear the statements. I don't agree with the facts. So, as Larry brought out, the city has capacity to issue bonds. That capacity is based on a fixed 2006 limit on property taxes in the city. So it's no different than when you refinance your home. You're taking money out. So in this situation, the property taxes for the city's obligation bond program have already been set aside. When old bonds are retired, new bonds are issued. So the same pool of property taxes that go to the general obligation bond are always the same amount. It's why it's not a tax increase. However, that said, where Larry is correct is that the amount of general obligation bond that the city can get for the same amount of property tax can be reduced. So that's how big the entire GEO bond program is. So he mentioned a capacity of 1.5 billion. So as an example, if rates are higher, but you're still using the same amount of property tax to buy GEO bonds, you can't do a $400 million GEO bond. You can only do a $200 million one. That's how tax and interest rates impact the GEO bond program. But the amount of tax that San Franciscans pay towards that GEO bond program has been fixed since 2006. So
if I could just direct our listeners to the following. Oh, I'm so sorry. That's not, that link won't work.
Okay,
My
let's
apologies for that.
I think that question has been responded to by both of you. Let's get to the next question from Jerry. Jerry, you're up.
Thank you.
Unmute. Yeah, there you are. Okay.
I
Go
think
ahead.
Both speakers have made some excellent points, and I do want to raise a couple of things. I think most of us agree with what Jonathan said the city seems to agree to, and that is that we focus on the existing systems and not get too grandiose about expansions right now until the dust clears. And that kind of brings me to a statement that was made to Batwig a few months ago by Alan Pisarski, who is a nationally renowned transportation consultant. He was talking about the entire country, not just San Francisco, not just the MTA. And what he basically said was, a lot of these transit properties are operating on autopilot. They are proceeding as based upon decisions and analyses were made pre-COVID. And I think that's absolutely applicable here. In fact, San Francisco, in a way, has an even greater cause for concern about that. Number one, there's COVID. COVID has shut down everything. Number two, San Francisco has a very concentrated financial center, and that is especially vulnerable to change in commuting habits. And there's nothing so that I've seen so far that really addresses that. And the third is that we have, it sounds like from what the controller said, we already have excessive funds. So what I worry about, and either one of you could respond to this, what I worry about is when there's excessive funds and then hundreds of millions of new funds come along, there's a strong tendency to want to spend that. And I've seen more cases than one where what was promised is not what the money was used for. So I would especially like to hear what Johnson has to say about that. There are some definite issues here that might cause somebody to want to change what you're talking about in the bond issue itself.
Yeah. Okay. That one is to Jonathan first. Go ahead.
Thank you, Jerry. That was a great question. So again, since we're talking about the controller's office review, it doesn't matter whether you look at the optimistic, the most likely, or the pessimistic. All of them show that at some point in the future, on the operations side, again, not capital, that Muni will end up in deficit, that its costs will grow faster than its revenues, and that the revenues will not keep up. So again, that's operations. So let's talk about capital and kind of post-pandemic and what the world should look like. So a year ago, about this time, the MTA did a scientific survey, not one of those where people just call online, a demographic voter-based survey to get a sense of what San Franciscans thought that the agency should focus on, knowing that their transportation choices would be different. So this was in the middle of the pandemic. It wasn't before the pandemic, it was during the pandemic. That resulted in August in Transportation 2050, which was exactly what's being talked about here. The new world post-pandemic is going to be different. It makes no sense to completely go back to those old plans and what was expected to be done. The number one thing during the pandemic out of that survey was that the MTA focused on state of good repair and fixing the system as is. So again, fixing a Muni yard that is 100 years old is not seismically safe, does not have modern technology to maintain a modern fleet, when in the region, MTC, the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, does not prioritize this type of infrastructure, and there's no other way to fund it, using a geo bond is the best way to go. When we still have issues with traffic congestion in the city, prioritizing transit and trying to get people back to Muni so the Muni operating budget can be restored, i.e. through fare revenue and parking revenues, the system better be good. The trains better get through the subway. The overhead lines better not fall. There should not be derailments in the system. Vehicles should not break down in service. And so the majority of this bond, again, and I do want to restate one of Larry's facts, $42 million is going to replace traffic signals in the city. That is more money than comes from the sales tax for this type of replacement. It's usually about $3 million a year. It's why we are where we are from the transportation sales tax. This is why we are behind on replacing that so it is infrastructure replacement. So I agree. Like, we needed to rethink things. A survey was done. The survey of San Franciscans said, Muni, you know what? Maybe it's not time for big BRT expansions or talking about subway expansion right now. It's time for you to fix what you have. And facilities and maintenance bays, traffic signals, making sure that Muni is reliable through dedicated lanes and signal priority, and making sure that the streets of San Francisco are safe as people are walking around is what the priority of this bond is.
Larry, you have a response. Go ahead.
Yes. I know you asked us not to do such a thing, but maybe just because we've gone back and forth on this point a few times, I'm just putting, this is the chart this is a picture of the San Francisco 10-year capital plan regarding this is the general obligation bond program. This right here is the June 22 transportation $400 million bond. That would be the bond that they start borrowing starting in 23 next year over the next 3 years. This is the property tax rate. This is what it is today. This is it going up each year. And the contribution of this $400 million bond to property tax rates going up. This line is the 2006 target, where it turns out that during the pandemic, we managed to pay down some of our debt. Thank you to the federal government, and thank you to the taxpayers of San Francisco. But this bond and some of these other bonds, which are a lot smaller. Look at how much smaller some of the other scheduled bonds are in these out years, which are related to other priorities. Please take a look at the capital plan. Jonathan is just flat out wrong when he says that the property tax rate is fixed. And the additional point that I've made is that it's not the government that sets your property taxes. It is the bond market, unfortunately. Thank you.
Sorry, Bob, I got to respond to that. So Larry showed you the right chart, and that red line was the tax rate. And that is a straight line. And everything below it, that white space, was retiring old bonds. And the same property tax at the same property tax rate is what is used to finance future bonds. So the tax rate, he just showed you, it's the red line. And the amount of financing for those geo bonds stays at that red line. So taxes aren't raised. The amount of geo bonds that can be bought is what changes over time. So he showed you the right chart, and he showed you that the red line, which is the tax rate, does not change. So I want to be very clear about that.
Thank you. Herb, you're next. Herb, you can unmute.
Okay.
Herb.
My
Good.
concern is this. We've passed bond after bond after bond after bond, and there's no improvement whatsoever. And I just have a feeling that, this is just going to be money down the rat hole. And I take Muni regularly. I don't see that much improvement. And so basically, it's going to be more bond, more bond, more bond to the end of time. And I'm just very frustrated by it. And I don't see how there's going to be any improvement. In fact, things are getting worse. And I don't want to have a higher tax rate to add insult to injury. Thank you.
Well, I don't think that was a question. I think that was more of a statement, and we've covered some of those things. So I'm going to move on. Howard Wong, you're next. Go ahead, Howard.
Well, Bob, I hope we have an opportunity to discuss the mission of Muni, and that does go to the comment.
Okay, Howard Wong, go ahead.
Thanks for this really educational forum. How does Muni structural deficit compare to comparable transit systems in other cities? And second part of that is, how did the structural deficit grow to the point that it is at? Thank you.
I guess that's to Jonathan first. Go ahead, Jonathan, and then Larry can have a chance at that.
So San Francisco's MTA is very unique in the United States. It's the only municipal organization in the US that is a city's Department of Transportation, a city's taxi commission, and large transit agency all in one. So as an example, part of what has happened, so to give some comparison over the course of the pandemic, there are many transit agencies like New York MTA, for example, that had to sell operating debt. Like they literally sold debt to cover their operations. Their structural deficits are much worse than the SFMTA here in San Francisco. Muni did not use any of its reserves during the pandemic. That's one of the contingency plans talked about in the memo, that the reserves are actually the reserves for uncertainties if things are to get worse. So, that kind of gives you a sense. Muni's, revenue bond and bond ratings stayed pretty consistent, just moved with the rest of the nation, but continues to be one of the highest rated agencies in the United States compared to its peers. And I think overall how it grew, and I appreciate the question, Howard, is that when the MTA was created in 1999, there was a general theory that if you combine parking, and in most cities in the United States, parking revenues, extra general fund, to do things within a city. It's always seen as extra. You go back to what its original purpose was. It was to move people through commercial corridors, but it's seen as extra general fund. In San Francisco, we decided to take those revenues, meaning we get more revenue than it costs to run the parking operation, to put that all into Muni. And that was the decision, with a fixed general fund set aside. So fixed, like the percentage of the pie stayed exactly the same over time, no matter if costs or contracts or services changed. And so what I like to say is the progressive transportation policies that we have today, like we would like to reduce fares, right? If costs increase, in theory, you would index up fares, and sometimes Muni has and sometimes it hasn't. In this cycle, it won't. There's an expectation that Muni be made free for a lot of riders. So that's fair rep. Most other transit agencies do not offer the free or discounted programs that Muni does. Actually, very few, if any, in the United States do, right? So that's a change. That's a progressive transportation policy. We want fewer people to drive cars in San Francisco, right? So if there are fewer cars on the road, fewer people are parking. And so our parking revenues decline over time. So I think the theory was good back in 1999, but how people use transportation and how revenues are generated today based on what we want the system to produce, though the financial policy and the transportation policy do not match up anymore. And that is why we're seeing costs grow faster than revenues that are staying flat or growing very tepidly. What the pandemic did was it quickly exacerbated that problem. Right? So ridership went so far down, so did fare revenue. Because the daytime population of the city is so low, parking revenues have recovered, but there aren't tourists in the city. People aren't coming in and paying the meters or using the garages for meetings, throughout the Bay Area during the day. And telecommuting has really impacted the daytime population and the use of the system. So I think, those are elements that absolutely post-pandemic we have to take into consideration when we think about how we want to finance our transportation system.
Larry, go ahead. You're next. Go ahead. You have an answer.
Yes. So I think that rather than look at where other cities are, which would mean we'd be looking at where other cities were after and before the pandemic, because it's hard to get a handle even on our own city post-pandemic. We need to start trying to understand the role of Muni, of the MTA, post-pandemic, and what San Francisco can do, what maybe only San Francisco can do to lead the way. We're facing a situation where the system has tried to restore the routes and the services that we had before, while paying homage to some of the efforts by Connect SF, some of the neighborhood organizations, the community activists, the environmental equity, the civil rights activists who are such an integral part of Transportation 2045. But the priorities seem to be on this effort to push, to restore work, to restore a, what did Mayor Breed do? The work, get back to work pledge, the trying to get everyone back on Muni as if it's pre-pandemic. We're talking about building out a system when what we're seeing is utilization at much lower levels, spread throughout the day, spread throughout the system. How does San Francisco or any major city handle lower utilization of large transportation vehicles like buses or Siemens subways when you have a handful of riders spread across the day? How do you approach this rationally and equitably? How do you redirect resources to underserved communities? You know, when Mayor Breed looked at the lower level of activity downtown, she saw that a lot of companies were asking employees maybe to just come in 3 days a week. Her idea was, why don't we try to make it the same 3 days of the week? At least that was an idea of how you could try to get people to concentrate, who are trying to use some resources, to concentrate the use of resources in a smaller block of time. I mean, we need to start talking about how Muni can operate and serve important elements in this community, which is elements that didn't get service before the pandemic. How can Muni do this? It's not going to do this by doubling down on plans that are going to leave our system so horribly underutilized. That is death for the Muni system. Thank you.
I'm going to interject one question from a member who could not be with us tonight, and this is to Jonathan. Jonathan, the latest PMOC report shows that the deficit on the Central Subway has grown to somewhere over $350 million. Now, the language in this bond issue is fairly permissive about what can be done with the money. My question is twofold. Number one, is any of this money, or can you say definitively that none of this money will be used to pay off any debts incurred by the Central Subway? And number two, if that is the case, the money can only come out, it seems, from the reserve funds of the Muni, and it will have to be replaced. Can you respond to how you're going to handle that Central Subway deficit?
Question one, I can definitively say that the GEO bonds cannot go to the Central Subway and will not. Second, I don't know the answer to that yet. I think the PMOC has done a projection, I think the project is close to being completed. I think that payments have been made to the contractor to finish the project. But the MTA's got to pay its bills. So yes, there will be a time where that's going to be the situation and that's going to have to be dealt with. But let's have that conversation that Larry's talking about the future of Muni and what people want Muni to be. I think many people on this call and SaveMuni have called for the MTA to restore 100% of pre-pandemic service. And Muni hasn't yet. I think many people want to see the Muni fleet well maintained. I think many people want to see there not being any delays in the subway. These are not new, expansive 10-year-old plans about adding ridership or expanding. It is about making the system work for the people who are here now, because that's what they want. So, you know, the MTA, I'm not going to say is perfect at always listening to people, but the plan has changed. People want the vehicles to be maintained. They want the facilities to be seismically safe. They want dedicated lanes for transit for improved reliability. They want the streets safer and the number of fatalities reduced. And that's what the future of San Francisco should be, a safe and reliable Muni system. And that is what this bond recommends to do and invest in. So not the central subway, not expansion projects. Again, focusing on fixing what San Franciscans have said over and over does not work with Muni. I mean, one issue that came up that has improved, the mean distance between failure, which means how many miles does it take for a Muni vehicle to break down in service, has been significantly reduced. That fleet is at its midlife. We do not have modern maintenance bays. We have pits where we are trying to maintain these vehicles to do the first midlife overhaul that has ever been done on the Muni fleet. So it stays reliable. So we don't have vehicles breaking down every 1,000 miles and every 45 minutes on the 49 Van Ness, like we used to see. So again, the future is fix the system. So for those of us who are here, it is safe and reliable. And again, that's what the bond invests in.
Okay. Larry, you get a short response, if you'd like.
Everything specified in the bond, everything that Jonathan just talked about, Muni can do without the bond. Muni is doing a great deal of capital investment. As I pointed out, over the next 10 years, this represents only 7% of Muni's capital budget. The rest is paid for by other sources. Some of those sources come with they come with restrictions, but a lot
local match requirements.
Yeah,
local match requirements.
But none of the federal programs that contribute to Muni require that Muni go out and incur general obligation municipal debt, sir.
Okay.
They don't.
Yeah. Were you finished, Larry?
Yeah. Well, so I think the point is that while there are programs that require certain types of programs, well, there are federal grants or state grants that require that you engage in certain types of programs. These grants do not require that you go out and incur general obligation debt like this. So that Muni that wants to borrow rather than use these other sources of funding that we've talked about, that the controller found over 500 million in the projections, the mistakes made by Muni in the projections. There is no need for this borrowing.
Bob, can I ask my question now? So, Larry,
no, not quite yet, because we have two more questions that we're going to have, and then we're going to go to the other question. I have to ask your both of your indulgence. This is going a little bit longer for the questions than we anticipated. Is it okay if we fit in two more questions and then go to the rest, the summaries? You guys okay with that?
Yeah, sure.
Jonathan, you okay?
Yeah, no problem.
Okay. Then that ends the SaveMuni questions. Going to go to Zach Deutsch-Gross from the Transit Riders. Zach, your question, please.
Thanks, and I really appreciate everybody hopping on, and Larry and Jonathan for taking so much time with us tonight. I think my question, Larry, for you is I've heard a lot of arguments that why this bond isn't perfect, and they make sense, or at least some of them do to me. But I don't understand what your vision is for how we fund Muni, how we make safer streets, how we rebuild their crumbling infrastructure and invest in zero emissions buses without this bond. What is your vision of saving Muni if we don't fund Muni? And to what I think you're going to say around the 97% other things that being funded, if you look at the capital improvement plan or the transportation 2050 plans, there is not enough funding for transportation. You look at MTC's regional plan, there is not enough funding to meet our transportation needs with these current plans. So I don't buy the 95% sold, the 95% funded. It's clear that we need more funding for transit. And I'd like to hear how you propose we save Muni, how we get there by not funding transit.
Okay, that was definitely to Larry. Go ahead, Larry.
Mm-hmm. San Francisco is funding transit. It's funding transit in a big way. Proposition K, Proposition B, general fund allocations, parking fees, taxi medallions, could go on and on. Regional funding, state funding, federal funding. Muni is well funded to make capital investments. In my view, to save Muni, we need to save Muni from these pre-pandemic plans, enabling Muni to roll forward the vision and the specific elements of these capital investment plans from before the pandemic without a complete rework, without a disruptive event threatens the future of transit here in San Francisco. You know, go back to the value of transit first. Transit first made a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense when you're in an economic system that it seems to create an unbreakable momentum for mobility, need for mobility in our personal lives as commuters, going to jobs in concentrated downtown urban areas, 5 days a week, if not 7. But mass transit at its best is only less polluting, less consuming of scarce resources than automobiles. First best is eliminating the need to transport as many people as possible. And I think that is a value we need to start thinking about. And, on this call and as a part of this debate, we have some of the best minds in transit and community outreach, in environmental issues, in issues in issues of social justice. There are underserved communities who have unmet transit needs today. There are communities throughout the city where transit systems are routing mostly empty buses and subways for most of the day. There is a tremendous mismatch between need and resources in this city. And if we simply fund, as taxpayers and as citizens, the existing status quo, it is so unsustainable. In the out years, I agree with the controller's analysis. I think even Jonathan was waving it around. A few years from now, we have a completely unsustainable situation. We need to start addressing it today. And for goodness sakes, do not keep enabling government to pursue a pre-pandemic strategy when the rest of us have moved on to a post-pandemic life.
Okay. All right. Jonathan, you're next. Oh.
Don't worry about it, Bob. I mean, I will repeat it again. We are getting mixed up between operations and capital. The recommendations and the development of this bond were based on surveys and outreach during the pandemic, not pre. Plans were adjusted for a post-pandemic world. San Franciscans want more service, not less. They want that service to be reliable. They want the infrastructure invested in, and they want the streets safe. This bond continues a pattern of no tax increases and goes for core infrastructure such as maintenance bays, buildings, grounds that are seismically unsafe and over a century old. You simply need to walk down Market Street. I remember being told about this. Walk down Market Street on any particular day and look at the traffic signals. You will see the rust and you will see the age. San Franciscans want this infrastructure replaced. They want more Muni service. They want that service to be reliable. And this bond makes investment. I think the last thing that I do want to say is that, yes, this bond is 9% of the Muni capital program, but the sales tax is proposed to be back on the ballot. You want to know why? Because it's exhausted. It needs to be extended. So those dollars aren't there unless there's an act to the voters. The other sources that Larry talked about all have strings. Those strings are called local match, locally generated resources. All the locally generated resources go to run Muni, not for capital. This is the city's capital contribution. And in the midst of this new infrastructure bill, where there will be billions of dollars at the federal and state level, the voters showing a commitment of $400 million that could bring in billions of dollars and be leveraged, 80 cents on the dollar, right? We put in 20% local match. This is the opportunity to see that investment occur in a new post-pandemic system. I do not disagree with Larry, but I think the system that San Franciscans want is one that works, not one that's expanded, not one related to growth. Again, a train control system that works and isn't DOS-based. Facilities that are seismically safe and will not collapse in an earthquake. I think those are reasonable investments, no matter what you want Muni to be. I'm not saying we don't need to have that conversation. I'm just saying we want to invest in a foundation that allows for the resiliency of the system, no matter what the future looks like.
Okay, one last question, and I see a hand from Luis Castillo. Luis, you're up next, and you have the last question. Yes, unmute yourself. And also, there's a hum again. Would whoever is doing that hum try to? Yeah, thank you, Luis. I don't see you unmuted. So
okay,
there you go. There you go.
yes, sorry about that. Yes, I want. My question is there any money allocated to fix the elevators that go to the subway?
I can take that really quick. So believe it or not, the old bond, the last bond, did actually invest in repairing some of the elevators and some of the escalators at the Muni Metro. So as an example, the first new elevator to be constructed on the Muni Metro is going to be constructed at the Castro station. And yes, under the facilities category, that 250 million, stations are one of those elements, including elevators, which are things that need to be repowered and invested in. So yes, under facilities, elevators are a component of that.
Okay. I think that one is was just directed to Jonathan. He's answered it. Right. So now the next phase. Yes.
Hello. This is Mark Norton. I've had my hand up for a while, and
Mark, I haven't seen you. Gee. Okay. Yeah.
I'm on the
okay.
phone.
Well,
maybe that's.
Oh, that's why. Okay. Go ahead. We'll let you get in here.
For both participants. So this, as I understand it, we're being sold that this is a $400 million bond. If I understand it correctly, that's how much we're authorizing Muni to borrow. That's going to have to be paid back interest. So my question is, in the long run, with the interest, how much will this actually cost? I know interest rates vary, and nobody knows exactly what they'll be, but perhaps we could get a range what this will actually cost. Thank you.
Okay, Jonathan, go ahead.
I was going to let Larry answer that one first. What I will say is there's a general interest rate, as Larry has stated. It's going to depend on when the bonds are issued. Sometimes that could be 3%. Larry mentioned that during high inflation and periods of economic disruption, it's been as high as 13%. So it's hard to say. It could be double the amount. It could be a third of the amount in just debt service for the bond. What I will say, though, Larry's brought this up a couple of times, is the intention is to issue the bonds sooner rather than later. Part of the strategy around that is the Fed has announced interest rate increases, right? So you want to try to get ahead of those interest rate increases and again, get the most bang for your buck. So Larry has been correct, not exactly correct about the tax, but the amount of bond you can get with the amount of financing you have is dependent on the interest rates in the markets. So the sooner that the bonds can be issued, the quicker they can get to projects, the less you're paying on cost escalation, and hopefully the less you're paying in bond financing. So that's the best answer I can give.
Yep. Larry, go ahead.
I can give you an example from the bond documents from last year's issuance. So there are about, I think, 4 current bond programs that still have outstanding authorized bonds. There is a total of $2 billion authorized but unissued. And so they did an offering last year, and that offering brought the total amount of bonds issued up to $2.6 billion. All right, just stay with me here for a second. So with the $2.6 billion that's outstanding, as of last year, they projected with all interest and principal would cost taxpayers $4 billion by the time they were paid off. So $2.6 billion translated to $4 billion. That was the borrowing cost. So this, if we are looking at the same type of borrowing costs on a $400 billion program, maybe we would be looking at about 650 to 700 million total obligation back to taxpayers. But that is at interest rates of about 2%. We're at we're heading into an inflationary period, back in 1982, these interest rates went as high as 13%. So the question is, how quickly do they rise? How quickly are these bonds going to be issued? I know that the MTA wants to try to issue them over the first 3 or 4 years of the program. I will tell you that the suggestion that the MTA has these projects truly shovel ready, and the suggestion that the MTA has the staff, the engineering staff prepared to do these projects already hired, and now this bond requires that all outside contracting be through the city's project labor agreements, which means that 100% unionized with no possibility of competitive bidding by non-union contracts. The MTA has always been exempt from this requirement. That this slipped into the bond by the Board of Supervisors. There's a lot to be concerned about here.
Okay. All right. With that, the question period is over, and we'll go to the question from Jonathan to Larry, and then vice versa. Go ahead, Jonathan. You had a question for Larry.
Oh no. I mean, my question for Larry was largely, I think we've been mixing capital and operating sources, and the capital sources of the MTA are actually extremely limited on the local side. Most of the transportation sales tax goes to match federal dollars, which is legally required. And outside of that, there's very little local commitment to transportation infrastructure in the city. The majority of the revenues for transportation infrastructure come from the federal government. And those dollars, now require increased federal match. So where would you propose that the additional local San Francisco dollars come from to leverage, especially a lot of these competitive grants that will require a local commitment to secure?
I'd like to see a more clear presentation by advocates for Proposition A of exactly what federal grants are either available and specifically in question or at risk over the question of Proposition A. I've asked for it.
The transit and intercity rail program at the state.
Jonathan,
bus facilities grant with the Federal Transit Administration. Raise grant, USDOT.
Jonathan, I would appreciate it if you provide me with the list. I've been looking for it.
Okay.
So I would appreciate that detail.
There are 3 of them.
All right, I would appreciate that detail. Part of the significant part of the bond goes to the so-called safe streets portion of infrastructure, and this is a long-term investment, we're told, but in many ways it's a replacement or a stand-in for the quick build program that's been so successful in responding rapidly to experimenting in the area of Vision Zero, where we've been able to quickly move in the direction of testing slow streets. We've been able to build and dismantle, relocate, build and dismantle. When Mayor Breed commented on quick build, she talked about how much more successful this was compared to the difficult, the slow, the impossible. I'm sorry, getting a little feedback. Conventional program that could not respond rapidly enough to emerging traffic, dangerous situations along the tragic risk corridor. My concern is that many of the things in this bond don't meet the threshold of infrastructure, but rather are programs that could be addressed through the kinds of funds that Jonathan was talking about, that are local funds, and better addressed through programs like Quick Build. Now, we are at an interesting stage of replacing our subways with the Siemens. We're replacing many of our buses as we converted from diesel to electric, and our fleet is going to be moving toward more hybrid vehicles. This is an interesting time for us to focus on these new vehicles and not spend as much building or rebuilding the infrastructure to maintain and upgrade the old diesel vehicles. Now, one of the choices that we get to make at this time, and it's a choice that I really don't hear Jonathan addressing, is what's the proper scale of Muni? It's a very hard question to address, changing the scale of Muni to adapt to new circumstances. I'll address this more. I guess I have a closing statement.
No, Larry, before that, you get a question of Jonathan. If you'd like to ask one.
No, I didn't know about questions at the end, and I think we can move on.
That's okay. That's all right. Okay, then we'll go to closing statements. Larry, your closing statement first, and let's have the same length of time, about 4 minutes, for your closing statement. Larry?
Yeah, thank you. San Francisco has an opportunity to lead the way in transit in a way that it has in the past, in the post-pandemic era. And we have got to break free of the thinking that we've seen in Transportation 2030, 45, and 50. Kudos and congratulations to the fine work done in those analyses. And I wish we could pull together again the team we brought together in 2045, in the 2045 task forces. Times have changed. The people of San Francisco during the pandemic, we jumped across a chasm to the other side of a canyon. We are in a new world of remote work, hybrid work, work from home. We've found that we don't need to be daily commuters into a central downtown. We were at 2% unemployment in March of 2020. When the pandemic hit, we went up to double-digit unemployment in the city of San Francisco. Well, in early March, Mayor Breed spoke to San Francisco and said, it's time to get back to work. She proclaimed the Get Back to Work pledge and asked San Francisco companies to open their doors downtown again and bring their workforces back at the end of March. I don't think it went very well, but why? Unemployment at the beginning of March in 2022 was 3%. 3%. We're already back at work. San Francisco has figured out, and much of the country, in fact, has figured out how to reduce the role of transit in their lives. And, it's a blessing, one of the few to come out of the pandemic era. And we need to embrace this and figure out, and it is difficult. It's probably the most challenging issue for mass transit in our lifetime. What do we do with a system as comprehensive as Muni? If ridership declines by 50% and spreads across the the time and places where we're offering service. What is a rational approach to reducing the resources that we are spending on the system, or if not reducing them, how do we allocate them more equitably to the underserved communities? How do we connect neighborhoods that have been remote and disconnected in this society? Muni's not talking about that. This bond is going to enable the same, not just rolling forward the same strategy. Vote no on Proposition A is change. Join me in saving Muni. Vote no on A.
All right, thank you. And Jonathan, your closing statement.
Well, thanks to Larry and for this great group. This is not my first time in front of the SaveMuni team here, and I always find it fun and spirited conversation. I think what we have here is a Rubik's Cube with a bunch of different colors on every different side. So let me try to straighten out that Rubik's Cube for you. So the general obligation bond is about capital investment, not the operations or the distribution of service of Muni. As far as I've heard, San Franciscans want Muni to come back. Mayor Breed has talked about people going back to work because San Francisco is the only county in the state of California that has not had its sales tax recovered. Why is that? Because the people who come to work and spend money in the city are from throughout the Bay Area. Their money gets spent here. Their tax dollars stay here. Those tax dollars get invested in San Francisco. Not saying it's perfect, not saying the world has changed, but we do want the city's economy to recover. We do want tourists to come back. We do want people from throughout the Bay Area to come to San Francisco, shop, and participate in our local businesses. Transportation is a key element of getting us there, both for the people that live here and the people that visit the city. Now, another side of that Rubik's Cube that seems to be mixed up. This is not a pre-pandemic plan. You're not hearing anything about expansion. You're not hearing anything about growth. You are hearing about fixing the system as it is. That is what you're hearing. You're not hearing about new BRTs. You're not hearing about expanded subways. You're not hearing about transportation improvements for growth. You're hearing about fixing the train control system, dedicated lanes for transit so it's more reliable, fixing traffic signals so we can manage congestion for everyone in the city, making our streets safer by taking quick build and making some of those temporary improvements permanent. That's what this bond invests in. It invests in San Francisco infrastructure. It sets us up to leverage other federal and state dollars, and it is not a tax increase. I repeat again, it is not a tax increase. It is us using property taxes set aside for capital infrastructure in this city for transportation infrastructure. So that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about a general obligation bond for capital, for infrastructure that would need to be repaired no matter what the transportation system is. Traffic signals need to be fixed. Bulb outs on curbs where there are fatalities need to be built. Maintenance bays for the Muni fleet need to be modernized, and we need to have facilities that are resilient in case of an earthquake. These are simple things that San Franciscans have supported over and over and over, and it is a post-pandemic view. It's a post-pandemic view that as the city recovers, people want its transportation system to work. And if it works, more people will ride it. If it works, we will work towards meeting our climate goals. If it works, people will come back and the MTA's operating revenues will recover. These are all core elements of the bond as it was thought out. So I leave it to the brilliant voters of San Francisco. And I thank you all for your time.
Thank you very much. And thank both of you for a very spirited and very civil debate.